While you're shopping for matcha, you might come across words like Okumidori or Asahi or Samidori. And while these may sound like random Japanese words, these actually mean something, and they are referring to cultivars. What is a cultivar? I'll tell you, that's the topic of this video. A cultivar is a cultivated variety. You take those two words and you smash them together and you get the word cultivar. While cultivar might sound like a fancy term, you've probably come across cultivars in your day-to-day life. If you go to the grocery store and go shopping for apples, you'll see things like Red Delicious or Gala or Fuji or Honeycrisp. In fact, almost all modern commercial agricultural products are grown as cultivars, but we don't really think of them like that. Apples are one exception, and grapes for wine are another. You can pick up a wine that says Pinot Noir or Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon, and these are referring to cultivars of grapes. In the wine industry, they use the word varietal, but cultivated varietal is the same thing. In the tea world, in English, we use the word cultivar, and for Japanese tea, the word in Japanese is hinshu. Now, what makes a cultivar? It is the fact that each plant of a specific cultivar is genetically identical to any other plant of this cultivar. Before we get into that, let's zoom out a tiny bit and look at what tea plants actually are biologically and how cultivars became the primary way tea is grown today. You might know that tea, properly speaking tea, not herbal tea, comes from the plant known as Camellia sinensis, the tea plant. This is the family name Camellia and the species name sinensis. You might also know that under this species there are subspecies. Camellia sinensis assamica, the type grown in Assam in India and from other places that grow this type of tea. And there's also Camellia sinensis. Well, bear with me. That is the type of tea that is grown in China and also what was brought to Japan in the 8 to 1200s, or thereabouts. For centuries, these tea plants were propagated by seed, you know, the normal way that plants grow. The flowers get pollinated and they produce seeds, and you take these seeds and you plant them and you get a new plant. The problem with this is that each tea plant grown from seed is genetically different to its parent plants. This means it has a different flavor, it produces differently shaped leaves, it buds at a different time, and it might be a different color. On the rare occasions that you can see tea growing wild, propagated by seed naturally, you can actually see these differences between two neighboring plants. When I went to Sefuriyama in Saga Prefecture, which is where tea was, as legend goes, planted in the 1200s by Eisai, some of the wild tea plants that have descended from these mother tea trees show quite drastic color variation between two individual plants that are right next to each other. This seed-grown style of tea is known as Zairai in Japanese, which directly translates to native, but seed-grown is a better definition. Historically, all tea plants were grown as Zairai, and each tea bush was individually handpicked whenever it was ready. It was the job of the head of the tea farm to go around the field and label the plants that were ready for picking. The tea pickers would then pick those plants, and then the next day the tea farmer would go look at the plants again and say, now these ones are ready for picking. This was a slow and not very scalable style of tea production. So by the late 1800s, after Japan had opened its borders to the West and learned about new styles of agricultural technology, they began to do some research into developing cultivars and how to propagate cultivars in tea production. Selecting cultivars was and is a long and laborious process. You have to take a field of 1,000 trees and see which ones produce tasty tea, which ones are more resistant to the cold or different diseases. And over decades, you can whittle these down, crossbreed them, hybridize them, until you find the perfect tea plant for your specific needs. And the first one to be developed was Yabukita back in 1906. Now that you've selected your mother cultivar tea plant, how do you propagate it? As I mentioned earlier, you can't just take its seeds and plant them because each seed-grown tea plant is genetically unique. So, the way of propagating tea cultivar plants is by cutting. You take the mother bush, you cut a bit of the branch off, and you plant it. Which means that every Yabukita tea plant in Japan comes from a cutting of another Yabukita tea plant. So they're all genetically identical to the one plant that was selected back in 1906. That's kind of neat. They're all clones. One downside to a clonal monoculture is that because the entire field is genetically identical, it can be incredibly susceptible to disease. Traditionally, if you had a field of genetically unique tea plants, maybe 4 or 5 of them might succumb to one disease, but the rest of the plants would be okay. If it's a cultivar tea field, then the entire tea field is affected. But on the upside, you can now harvest the entire tea field at the same time, which means you can now use mechanical picking, which makes things so much faster and you can harvest so much more tea. And it's a lot less fiddly than hand picking. When cultivars were introduced, they quickly became incredibly popular amongst tea farmers, especially in Shizuoka, where Yabukita was developed. To this day, Yabukita is the standard cultivar against which all others are compared. This is a Shizuoka cultivar handbook that lists dozens of cultivars that you can grow in Shizuoka, and it ranks them in comparison to Yabukita. If they bud earlier than Yabukita, they are an early budding tea cultivar. If they bud later than Yabukita, then it's a late budding tea cultivar. While cultivar tea, and especially Yabukita, became the standard for sencha in the 50s and 60s, the matcha side of the industry, mostly located in and around Kyoto and Uji, was slow to adopt it. Even by the 1970s, the majority of tea plants in Kyoto Prefecture were still Zairai, or seed-grown. This doesn't mean that cultivar development hadn't taken place in Kyoto, however. The first Uji cultivars started being developed in the early to mid-1930s. The earliest were Asahi and Uji-Hikari and Samidori, and these are still very popular today. Unlike the cultivars developed in Shizuoka, such as Yabukita, Koshin, and Yamakai, which were developed for sencha, most of the cultivars that were developed in Uji were developed for matcha, or tencha, which gets ground into matcha. Now that you know what a cultivar is, let's take a closer look at some of the most popular cultivars that are used for making matcha. First up, Yabukita. While I did say that Yabukita is mostly made for sencha, it is still the predominant cultivar across Japan, and it makes up about 52% of the tencha picked in Kyoto Prefecture. While it is popular, it doesn't make for a particularly tasty matcha. However, it is relatively easy to grow and has quite a high yield, especially when compared to the more specialty matcha cultivars. Because of this, it is a primary ingredient in the processing or culinary grades of matcha, and even finds its way into keiko or low-grade usucha matchas. The second most popular cultivar for tencha production in Kyoto is Okumidori, which means deep green, and it makes up around 19% of the total tencha harvest for first flush tencha. The name deep green isn't a coincidence, it is famous for having an incredibly vibrant green color. In fact, it has the same amount of chlorophyll in the leaves as Yabukita does when it's been shaded for 1 week. So it's kind of like a shortcut to having a deep green. It's already greener than Yabukita, but then you shade it and it gets even more green. As an example of how deep green this cultivar is, here is our Kanoyama matcha, which is 100% Okumidori, and here is our Uji-Hikari, which is 100% Uji-Hikari. While Uji-Hikari is considered to produce a higher quality tencha, the green of Okumidori is much darker and deeper, which lends itself to the name of the cultivar, deep green. The next most popular cultivar for tencha production in Kyoto is Samidori. Samidori was developed in the 1930s by Koyama Masajiro. If the name Koyama rings a bell, you might recognize it from Koyama-en. In this case, it is Yamamasa Koyama-en. Samidori has a relatively low yield of around 55%, but it's still perhaps the most popular for hand-picked tencha cultivars. And in my experience, Samidori has a lovely, soft, creamy taste along with plenty of umami. And that brings us to today's tea, which is a hand-picked, Honzu-shaded Samidori matcha from Yoshida Meiche-en in Uji. And I have it here in this little nifty sifter can. Today I'm whisking in a low foam style or pond style. This allows me to get more of the aroma and direct flavor out of the tea rather than a super frothy usucha. To learn more about how the amount of foam affects how matcha tastes, you can check out this video. Itadakimasu. I don't drink this tea often enough, this is good. It has the deep umami but a lot of these sort of really bright, slightly creamy notes on top of it. It's really smooth, it's really pleasant, and I should drink more of this tea. Yoshida-san's Samidori is one of his highest grade matchas, with the combination of around 40 days of traditional straw Honzu shading and delicate and fine hand picking. It is a wonderful expression of Uji matcha. The next most popular cultivar in Kyoto's tencha picking is Zairai. That's a catch. As I mentioned, Zairai isn't a cultivar, but it still makes up 5% of Kyoto's tencha production, which, considering it used to be 100%, the fact that it's now down to 5 is quite shocking, but the fact that it's still around is also quite shocking. While most of the Zairai fields in Kyoto Prefecture are being exchanged for the newfangled and fancy cultivars, some of them still remain, and there are a handful of farmers who continue to produce tea from these traditional seed-grown plants.
So recently, I think Zairai is very rare. 8 years ago, there are not so many. There are some Zairai farm. Everyone asked me, do you want to farm Zairai? Zairai? Yes, but recently, so already no Zairai farm. So nobody asked me. I think 8 or 10 years ago, everybody gave up.
One of the complications of talking about Zairai is that it is a catch-all term for a wide variety of plants. Everything grown by seed is Zairai, but as I mentioned, each one of these is unique. Asahi, Uji-Hikari, Samidori, all of these were developed from Uji Zairai, so there are Zairai plants out there that have similar flavor profiles. But because each one of them is genetically unique and they are unpredictable, it's hard to scale and replicate good Zairai harvests. It is said that at their best, Zairai can taste even better than any of the modern cultivars, but they only produce their best maybe once out of every 10 years, and it's a lot of work to handpick each plant and do some on one day and some on another to get the absolute best out of these seed-grown plants. Well, maybe 1 year out of 10 will be exceptional, around 6 to 7 will be okay, and maybe 3 to 4 years will be pretty bad. So the quality limit is potentially higher, but it's just a lot of work and it isn't really worth it for most farmers. Another popular tencha cultivar in Kyoto is Gokou. This cultivar is said to have a potato-like aroma, but apparently that disappears when you shade it. I've never had an unshaded Gokou, so I can't confirm or deny the presence of a potato aroma. That being said, it is an incredibly popular and high-quality tencha for matcha, but also produces wonderful gyokuro. It was developed by Kyoto Chaken, which is the shorthand for referring to the Kyoto Tea Research Institute. Like many of the other cultivars for tencha production, it was also selected from Uji Zairai. Next up on the list is a cultivar that has gotten quite popular outside of Japan, and that is Uji-Hikari. Like most of the other cultivars I mentioned today, Uji-Hikari is mostly sold in blends in Japan, but outside of Japan it's gained quite a following as a high quality and lovely tasting cultivar. Like Gokou, it was developed by the Kyoto Chaken, this time from Uji Zairai from Tokichi Nakamura, another famous tea blender in Kyoto. One of the unique aspects of Uji-Hikari is the shape of its leaves, which have this sort of wavy, undulating pattern, which makes them quite distinct and easy to spot in a field of tea plants. So these wavy leaves you can see are Uji-Hikari compared to like these much flatter leaves. These are Samidori. In my experience, Uji-Hikari has a distinct flavor that is sort of light and airy, but also with an undertone of strength and umami, with a sort of soft, slightly creamy finish. I'm still thirsty, so I'm going to make some more tea. I actually have 2 Uji-Hikari with me today that I can talk a little bit more about. This is the Uji-Hikari from Yoshida Meichen, the leaves you saw in the clip, and here is the Uji-Hikari from Tsuji-san, from Tsujiki. Both of these showcase the unique taste of the cultivar, but they are quite different. I find Yoshida-san's to be a little more traditional in its taste profile, with the sort of brightness and green roundness that you get from Uji Matcha, whereas Tsuji-san's is a little more extreme in its presentation of the cultivar, being even brighter and zestier and airier, without as strong of a body. This goes to show that while cultivars are important when it comes to determining the flavor of a matcha, there is a lot more that goes into it. from the terroir, the type of soil, the climate, the fertilization practices, the shading, the picking, and the processing. All of these have as much, if not more, impact on the final flavor of the tea. This rounds out the main selection of cultivars that are used for tencha production, but there are a few more niche ones that I'd like to touch on. One of the most famous of these niche small production cultivars is Narino. While the previous cultivars I mentioned were developed in the 1930s, Narino and its sister cultivar Okunoyama were selected in 2002 after a 20-year-long development process. They were selected by Horii Nobuo, the 5th generation head of Horii Shichimeien, another of Kyoto's legacy tencha blenders. In the 1980s, they decided to switch over from Zairai production to modern cultivar production, but they wanted to maintain some of the legacy of their tea plants, which had been planted there for over 400 years. So, over the next 20 years, he went through his Zairai field and selected the 2 best trees, whittling them down year to year until he landed on Narino and Okunoyama. And to this day, the 400-year-old mother tree of Okunoyama is still preserved in their garden. While Narino is a relatively new cultivar, it instantly gained recognition due to its incredibly high levels of theanine, or umami compounds, and its vibrant color and excellent taste. While the majority of Narino is still grown by Horii Shichimeien, there are a handful of other producers who also grow this cultivar, and one of them is Terakawa Toshio-san, whose Narino, along with his Samidori and Asahi, has made its way into our Uta no Mori blended by Rishoen. In addition to growing Narino, Terakawa-san also grows another unique and relatively niche cultivar, that being Terakawase, which, if you couldn't tell, is named after him because he developed it from his own selection of Uji-Zairai. Terakawase is known for being an extremely early budding cultivar, even earlier than Asahi. Part of what makes these incredibly niche specialty cultivars famous is that they are grown and produced by some of the best tencha farmers in Japan. You could take the same cultivars and put them in a different field in a different part of Japan, produced by different producers, and they would taste completely different, which goes to show that at the end of the day, cultivar is just one part of what goes into developing the flavor of a particular tea. As I mentioned, terroir, fertilization, shading, blending, etc. can all go into affecting the final taste of a tea. So just because it says Asahi on the Matcha label, that doesn't mean it will taste the same as Tsuji-san's Asahi or our Uji Asahi from Rishoen. You can think of it kind of like wine. A Pinot Noir from Napa Valley in California will taste very different from a Pinot Noir from somewhere in France. I don't know enough about wine. I stick to tea mostly. In a similar vein, just because you don't like one single cultivar version of, say, Gokou, that doesn't mean you might not like another. Another point to keep in mind is that single cultivar is just a style of matcha production and not really a marker of quality. While there are many incredibly high quality single origin, single cultivar matchas available, such as those from Yoshida-san, that doesn't mean that every single cultivar matcha is of the same high quality. The inverse of this is that blended matchas can also be of the same high quality or even higher quality. Take this Uta no Mori for example, it is blending some incredibly high quality tencha, like the Narino from Terakawa-san along with some tea from Tsuji-san. So while it may be easier to think that all teas of a certain cultivar taste the same and that all single cultivar matchas are better, the reality is a little more complex than that. So it's important that you try a lot of different teas to find out which ones you like. Speaking of which, I really like this tea and I'm still thirsty, so I'm going to make another bowl. This time I'm drinking it as koicha because it's tasty. If you're tea high like me, or just enjoyed learning about cultivars, please make sure to leave a like on this video. If you want to see more educational tea content like this, make sure to subscribe, because I'll be making more of these. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.
日本語も流れますからね。気をつけてください。日本人見ますんで。
翻訳機能もありますもんね。
今から一度の噂はちょっと。